Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Caleb Wright was born in October of 1995, the youngest child of Marcus and Elaine Wright in the quiet southern town of Fairmont Ridge. In a family already full of laughter, Caleb somehow became the center of it. He had a way of walking into a room and making it feel lighter without trying. His mother used to say that if joy had a sound, it would be Caleb laughing from the backyard. He was athletic in the effortless way, strong, fast, coordinated, but never arrogant about it. On the football field, he moved like the game made sense to him on a deeper level. On the basketball court, coaches noticed how quickly he adapted, how easily he read the floor. Off the field, he surprised teachers with how sharp he was. Numbers stuck in his head, patterns came naturally. He could calculate change faster than the register at the corner store. But what defined Caleb most was his future. He talked about it constantly: college football, going pro, buying his parents a house. He trained for it, lived for it. Everyone around him believed it was possible, not because he dreamed big, but because he worked like someone who already saw the finish line. Then, on January 11, 2013, everything stopped. Caleb was 17 years old when he was found in a place no one could make sense of. His body was discovered inside a tightly rolled wrestling mat in the old gymnasium of Fairmont High School. The mat stood upright in a shadowed corner where dust collected and echoes lingered longer than they should. His legs were visible near the top. His head was buried deep inside the coil. It looked unreal, like a nightmare that didn't belong in a school. The Fairmont County Sheriff's Office moved quickly, almost too quickly. Within hours, officials stated there was no sign of foul play. They said Caleb had accidentally fallen into the mat while reaching for a pair of sneakers. The State Investigation Bureau later ruled the death positional asphyxia. According to them, he had suffocated after becoming trapped upside down. The case, they said, was tragic, but simple. Marcus and Elaine Wright knew it wasn't. Something felt wrong from the very beginning. The timeline alone raised questions. January 9th was the first day back after winter break. Fairmont High followed a rotating block schedule, which meant students didn't attend the same classes every day. The campus had two gyms, a newer, well-lit one used for games and assemblies, and an older one that most students avoided unless they had to. In the old gym, wrestling mats were stored upright along the wall. Over the break, additional mats had been added and rearranged, changing their usual layout. Students sometimes used the hollow centers of the rolled mats to stash shoes or gym clothes, a workaround to avoid paying locker fees. Caleb had done it before. That afternoon, at 1:27 p.m., surveillance footage showed Caleb entering the old gym alone. He wore a hoodie and carried a folder under his arm. He never appeared on camera again. He missed his next class. No one flagged it. Teachers assumed he had been marked absent or switched periods. Practice came and went. The halls emptied. Night fell. Caleb never came home. Elaine called his phone again and again. No answer. By midnight, she knew. She couldn't explain it, but every parent understands that feeling when it arrives, the sense that something has gone terribly wrong. She reported him missing early the next morning. At the school, administrators printed flyers. They reassured her. Teenagers run late, phones die, miscommunications happen. Then, at around 10:30 a.m., everything shattered. A group of students had been sent into the old gym to complete a survey. Sitting on top of the wrestling mats, one of the girls noticed something strange: a pair of socks, just barely visible, stuffed inside one of the rolls. Someone joked that it must be a prank. Curiosity took over. One of them leaned down and looked inside. What she saw emptied the room of sound. A scream followed, then chaos. A student tried to pull the body free and immediately backed away. The smell told the truth before anyone could say it out loud. A teacher rushed in, and together they pushed the mat over. Caleb's body fell forward onto the floor. His face was swollen beyond recognition. The school went into lockdown. Students were moved to the new gym. Police arrived. Paramedics stood back, knowing there was nothing to be done. Elaine Wright was still in the building when she heard the words no parent should ever hear. They found him. Caleb had been there for nearly 21 hours, alone, in the dark. As the initial shock settled, more disturbing details surfaced. The official autopsy was completed quickly. The conclusion never changed. Accidental death, positional asphyxia, case closed. Marcus and Elaine Wright requested a second autopsy. What they discovered made their grief turn into horror. Caleb's internal organs were missing. His chest cavity had been filled with crumpled newspaper. Officials later claimed this was standard practice due to decomposition. The funeral home denied responsibility. The medical examiner's office denied involvement. No one could explain when or why it happened. The independent autopsy revealed something else, signs of blunt trauma to the neck. A direct contradiction. 2 autopsies, 2 conclusions, only one truth. As news spread, Fairmont Ridge changed. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. Civil rights organizations stepped in. The Wrights were arrested during a demonstration. The town divided itself into sides. Accident, cover-up. Those who trusted the system, those who didn't. Investigators said the evidence pointed to a tragic misjudgment. They described how Caleb might have tried to retrieve his shoes without tipping the mat over, how he might have climbed in head first, how gravity and panic worked against him, how suffocation doesn't always look violent. But the Wrights couldn't reconcile the details. The position of his arms, the lack of blood outside the mat, the shoes found beneath his body, the missing surveillance footage. Large gaps appeared in the video timeline from cameras inside the gym. Timestamps didn't match cameras outside. Entire segments were missing or corrupted. The footage was handled not by police, but by a school employee before turned over days later. Too many opportunities for error, or worse. Rumors began to circulate, names whispered, connections implied. Powerful families, protected reputations, nothing proven, everything denied. Years passed. Lawsuits were filed and dismissed. Federal agencies investigated quietly and released nothing. The town moved on. Marcus and Elaine did not. They exhumed his son's body more than once, searching for answers that never came. Every door they knocked on eventually closed. Every explanation felt incomplete. Was Caleb Wright the victim of a terrible accident, or was something far more deliberate hidden beneath layers of procedure and silence? That question still hangs over Fairmont Ridge, and somewhere, someone knows the answer. In the weeks after Caleb Wright's funeral, Fairmont Ridge tried to return to normal. The banners came down, the locker room was cleaned, the old gym was reopened with fresh paint and brighter lights, as if visibility alone could erase what had happened there. For Marcus and Elaine Wright, time did the opposite. The more days passed, the louder the unanswered questions became. They started with the official timeline. According to investigators, Caleb entered the old gym at 1:27 p.m. They claimed he likely attempted to retrieve his shoes from inside the wrestling mat shortly afterward and became trapped. They estimated death occurred within minutes, but this theory collapsed under basic scrutiny. Caleb was nearly 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and strong enough to bench press more than his own body weight. Wrestling mats weighed over 100 pounds each and were stored tightly packed together. To climb inside one upright mat head first without knocking it over or disturbing the others would have required an awkward precision that made no sense. Even more troubling was the position of his body. Photographs taken at the scene showed Caleb's arms pinned tightly against his sides, not flailing or extended forward as expected in a panic response. His shoes were found neatly placed beneath his torso, not clutched in his hands or scattered nearby. The narrative of a spontaneous accident began to feel less like an explanation and more like a script. Then there was the surveillance footage. The school had over 50 cameras, including multiple units covering entrances, hallways, and both gymnasiums. Investigators released a short clip showing Caleb entering the old gym. They never released footage of him inside. They said the cameras in the gym were not working that day. Maintenance records later showed those cameras had been operational the week before and repaired again shortly after Caleb's death. No documentation explained why they failed during the exact window that mattered most. Worse, a teacher later admitted under oath that a school administrator had accessed the video system before law enforcement arrived. That single detail changed everything. From that point on, the Wrights stopped believing in coincidences. Independent experts reviewed the footage that was available. They noted timestamp inconsistencies between interior and exterior cameras, minutes missing, sequences out of order, data corruption that did not match typical system failures. It looked edited, or at the very least, handled improperly. As pressure mounted, the state doubled down. Officials reiterated their findings. They emphasized that there were no signs of a struggle inside the gym, no overturned mats, no blood, no witnesses. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The second autopsy report added fuel to the fire. The independent pathologist documented bruising on Caleb's neck inconsistent with self-inflicted pressure. The marks suggested force applied from behind. They also found petechial hemorrhaging, often associated with strangulation rather than positional asphyxia. The state medical examiner dismissed these findings. They claimed the marks were post-mortem artifacts caused by decomposition and gravity. Then came the most disturbing revelation. Caleb's organs were missing. When the Wrights opened the casket for a private viewing before burial, something felt wrong. His torso appeared unnaturally collapsed. When they asked the funeral director, he said the body arrived that way. The medical examiner's office denied removing the organs. The funeral home denied replacing them with newspaper. No chain of custody documentation existed to explain what happened between the autopsy and burial. This was not a minor procedural error. It was a violation. Civil rights attorneys stepped in. They argued that evidence had been destroyed, whether intentionally or through gross negligence. They filed lawsuits demanding access to records, emails, internal communications. Most requests were denied. Those that were approved came back heavily redacted. Protests followed. Hundreds gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs with Caleb's face printed across them. Justice for Caleb became a chant that echoed through the town square. Marcus and Elaine were arrested during one of those protests for blocking traffic. The image of grieving parents being led away in handcuffs hardened public opinion overnight. Fairmont Ridge split in two. One side trusted the system, believed the authorities had no reason to lie, believed the Wrights were being driven by grief and unable to accept a tragic accident. The other side saw something darker. They pointed to Caleb's popularity, his academic success, his athletic future, and they asked a question no official wanted to answer. Who else was in that gym? Rumors spread quietly at first. Students talked about bullying incidents that never made it into reports, about hazing rituals involving wrestling mats, about arguments in the hallway earlier that day. Names surfaced, then disappeared. One name in particular refused to stay buried, the son of a well-connected local official. Nothing was ever proven. No charges were filed. Interviews were conducted and sealed. Statements contradicted each other and were later clarified. When federal investigators briefly stepped in, hope surged. Then they left. No public findings, no indictments, just silence. Years passed, but the case refused to die. True crime forums dissected every document. Independent analysts recreated the gym layout using blueprints. Physics experts ran simulations showing how unlikely the accident scenario was without external force. Each new analysis pointed in the same direction. This did not look like an accident, but proving that in court was another matter. The statute of limitations on certain charges expired, witnesses graduated, memories faded, evidence deteriorated, and yet one thing remained: the question of intent. If Caleb's death was accidental, it was the result of extraordinary circumstances lining up perfectly. If it was not, then someone benefited from the narrative staying simple. The Wrights never stopped searching. They gave interviews, filed appeals, spoke at universities and civil rights conferences. Their grief transformed into purpose, their pain into persistence. They didn't claim to know exactly what happened. They claimed something had been hidden. And as long as the truth remained buried beneath procedure and paperwork, they refused to let their son's name fade into a footnote. Because accidents don't erase evidence. People do. And somewhere between the locked doors of a school gym and the sealed files of an investigation, the full story of what happened to Caleb Wright was still waiting to be told. By the time the 10th anniversary of Caleb Wright's death arrived, Fairmont Ridge had learned how to live with the question instead of the answer. The old gym still stood, renovated, renamed. Students passed through it without knowing why some teachers avoided the corner where the wrestling mats once leaned. The banners on the walls celebrated championships, not silence. Marcus and Elaine Wright marked the anniversary alone. No press conference, no protest, just a quiet visit to the cemetery and then back home, where boxes of documents filled an entire room. Court filings, autopsy reports, emails obtained through public records requests, handwritten notes from strangers who claimed to know something, but never enough to go on record. Grief had turned their lives into an investigation that never ended. What changed everything came from an unexpected place: a former student. He reached out anonymously at first, an email sent from a public library computer, short, careful, afraid. "I was there that day," he read, "not in the gym, but close enough to hear things." Marcus and Elaine had learned not to hope too quickly. Still, they responded. Weeks passed before the man agreed to meet. He was in his late 20s now, nervous, hands shaking as he spoke. He said he had stayed silent because of pressure, because of fear, because of who was involved. He described raised voices in the hallway near the old gym shortly after lunch, a confrontation, not playful, not joking. He remembered a crash, not loud enough to draw attention, just wrong. Then nothing. He didn't see Caleb again. The name he mentioned matched one that had circulated in whispers for years. Still no proof, but something else had changed. Technology. Digital forensics had evolved dramatically in the decades since Caleb's death. Old video systems, once thought corrupted, could now be re-examined using modern recovery tools. Data fragments considered useless could be reconstructed. Marcus and Elaine submitted yet another request. This time, they found a private forensic lab willing to help. Against all odds, they obtained access to the original hard drives from the school's surveillance system. Not copies, originals, stored, forgotten, mislabeled. The lab worked for months. When the call finally came, Elaine couldn't breathe. They hadn't found a clear video of the incident. What they found was worse. Proof of deletion. Timestamps showed that footage from inside the old gym had existed, not just briefly. It had been recorded, stored, and then manually erased hours after Caleb entered the building. Not overwritten, deleted, and the deletion was logged. The user account responsible belonged to a school administrator. That discovery reopened everything. Media attention returned overnight. Headlines asked questions that were once dismissed. Why was footage deleted before police arrived? Why was the account access denied for years? Why had this never been disclosed in court? The administrator claimed it was routine maintenance. Digital experts disagreed. routine maintenance does not target specific time windows. The district attorney announced a review. Former students came forward not with accusations, but with context, stories of unchecked behavior, of favoritism, of disciplinary issues quietly resolved behind closed doors. No one claimed to have seen Caleb killed, but the picture changed. This was no longer about how a boy died, it was about how a system responded. An independent panel reviewed the medical evidence again, this time with modern standards and outside oversight. They acknowledged that the original ruling of accidental death relied heavily on assumption rather than reconstruction. They did not declare homicide, but they withdrew certainty. The cause of death was reclassified as undetermined. That single word carried enormous weight. It meant the accident narrative was no longer fact. It meant the case was no longer closed. Civil lawsuits followed. The school district settled quietly. No admission of wrongdoing, no explanation for the missing organs, no accountability for the deleted footage. Money changed hands. Truth did not. The person's name that had haunted the case was never charged. Not enough evidence, not enough witnesses willing to testify. Too much time passed. But something else happened. The silence broke. Caleb Wright was no longer dismissed as a tragic anomaly. His case became a symbol cited in discussions about evidence handling, transparency, and institutional accountability. Law schools studied it. Journalists revisited it. Forensic conferences debated it. Elaine once said in an interview, "I don't need revenge, I need honesty, even if it hurts." Marcus put it more bluntly, "Accidents don't need secrets." Fairmont Ridge will likely never know exactly what happened inside that gym, not fully, but it knows this. Evidence was altered, procedures were broken, voices were ignored, and a simple explanation was chosen over a complicated truth. Caleb Wright's story did not end with justice in a courtroom. It ended with a refusal to forget. And sometimes that is the only justice left. Not closure, but clarity. A reminder that when systems protect themselves, truth waits patiently, and eventually it demands to be heard. No one in Luma Valley could remember a time before the fighting shaped everyday life. The hills were still green, children still played in the dirt paths between homes, mothers still waited at doorways at dusk, but everything felt fragile, as if peace itself could shatter without warning. In that place lived a little girl named Ayla. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with a laugh that carried farther than anyone expected. Neighbors described her as gentle and curious, the kind of child who waved at strangers and asked too many questions. Her name meant light, and to her mother it was a promise more than a word. Ayla lived with her mother, Mariah, and her younger sister in the city of Cora, a crowded northern town shaped by displacement and uncertainty. Families there shared homes, resources, and worries. Everyone knew someone who had fled. Everyone had lost something. Mariah worked as a nurse at a local clinic. The job paid little, but it mattered. On days when the clinic ran long, she left her daughters with relatives. It was common in Cora. Trust was not given lightly, but it was often necessary. Every evening, Ayla waited by the door. When Mariah returned home, tired and dust-covered, Ayla would run into her arms. That moment, Mariah later said, was the best part of her day. No matter what she had seen at work, no matter how heavy the world felt, her daughter's embrace grounded her. Ayla had grown up knowing conflict as background noise. She knew why some buildings stood empty. She knew why food trucks arrived irregularly. She knew why people whispered when soldiers passed. Childhood in Cora learned to adapt. Ayla's father was absent. He had been detained years earlier during a sweep and later released, only to flee the region fearing retaliation. He left behind more questions than answers. Mariah never spoke badly of him. She only said he had done what he thought was necessary to survive. Raising two girls alone in Cora was not easy. Still, Ayla thrived. She liked drawing flowers. She counted steps as she walked. She helped her sister button her clothes. She had dreams that did not yet know fear. That trust would be broken on a day that began like any other. It was early August. The sun was already sharp by morning. Mariah prepared for a long shift at the clinic. She kissed both girls goodbye and left them with family members who lived in the same compound. Among them was a distant uncle by marriage, Darian Mecco, a man who had recently returned to the area. Darian was known, not loved. He was quiet, kept to himself, and rarely spoke in groups. No one had ever accused him of wrongdoing. In a place where people had learned to mind their own survival, that was often enough. By midday, Ayla asked to use the restroom. She never came back. At first, no one panicked. Children wandered all the time, but minutes stretched too long. A search began inside the compound, then beyond it. No one could imagine what had already happened. Ayla had been led away to a secluded area. What occurred there was an act of calculated cruelty that would later shake an entire nation. Authorities would confirm that she had been violently harmed and then deliberately left where she would be found, not hidden. It was not meant to go unnoticed. It was meant to send a message. Ayla was discovered by her younger sister. The child ran screaming. Neighbors rushed in. Someone called for help. Ayla was carried to the nearest hospital, but it was already too late. Medical staff later said there was no doubt her injuries were not accidental. This was not a fall. This was not chance. Mariah arrived at chaos. She was not allowed to see her daughter immediately. The doctors were crying. The nurses would not meet her eyes. When she finally understood what had happened, the world seemed to collapse inward. Her child was gone. The man responsible had been inside their lives. Worse still, he was not there when authorities arrived. Darian had vanished. Police quickly identified him as the primary suspect. He was unaccounted for during the time Ayla disappeared, and multiple inconsistencies emerged in his statements once he was briefly located and detained. But detention did not last. Within days, Darian escaped custody during unrest at the holding facility. In the confusion, he fled. Before disappearing, he reportedly sent threats to Mariah, warning her to stay silent. She did not. Instead, Mariah did what no one expected. She spoke. She went to local journalists. She contacted women's advocacy groups. She told anyone who would listen that her daughter had been murdered and that the man responsible was free. Her decision made her a target. Relatives of the suspect accused her of lying. Some claimed she was exploiting tragedy. Others warned her to stop talking. She moved constantly, staying with friends, then strangers. She left her job. Her life narrowed to survival and memory. Weeks passed before Darian was captured again. By then, the story had spread beyond Cora. When the trial began, the courtroom overflowed. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Medical testimony confirmed intentional harm. The placement of Ayla's body showed clear intent. This was not negligence. This was not confusion. It was violence. The verdict came swiftly, guilty. But when the sentence was announced, outrage followed. Darian received 25 years in prison with no possibility of early release. To many, it felt like a betrayal. Women's rights organizations immediately condemned the decision. Legal experts argued that the sentence failed to reflect the severity of the crime. Protesters gathered, holding signs with Ayla's name written in bold letters. Mariah stood among them, silent, exhausted, and unbroken. She had not asked for fame, she had asked for justice. Instead, she received threats. Even after sentencing, the harassment continued. Members of Darian's family accused her of destroying their lives. She reported the threats. Little was done. Still, she refused to disappear. Ayla's name began appearing online. Petitions circulated demanding a review of the sentence. International activists shared her story. Candlelight vigils were organized in cities far from Cora. Artists wrote songs. Mothers wrote letters. For the first time, Mariah felt something shift. The story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who refused to accept silence. But with attention came backlash. Some online voices claimed Ayla's death was being used to distract from political issues. Others questioned Mariah's motives. A few went further, using Ayla's background to justify what had happened. Those voices were loud, but they were not louder than the truth. As the world debated, Mariah prepared herself for the long fight ahead. The sentence might stand, the system might resist change, but Ayla would not be forgotten. Not now, not ever. The sentence was supposed to be the end of it. In the eyes of the court, justice had been delivered. A man was convicted. A number of years was assigned. Paperwork was signed, files were closed, and the system moved forward as it always did. But for Mariah, the sentence marked the beginning of something far heavier. She returned to an apartment that no longer felt like a home. Ayla's drawings still hung on the wall. Her shoes sat by the door, untouched. At night, Mariah found herself listening for footsteps that would never come. Grief did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes crushing. And beneath it all was anger. Not wild anger, not loud anger. A focused, determined kind. From the moment the verdict was read, Mariah understood something clearly. The system that had failed to protect her daughter was now asking her to be silent and grateful. 25 years, no acknowledgement of the threats, no recognition of how easily the suspect had escaped once already, no explanation for why a crime so deliberate was treated as something less. She refused to accept it. At first, she did not know where to begin. She was a nurse, not a lawyer. She had no political connections. What she did have was memory, persistence, and the willingness to speak when it was uncomfortable. She began by writing everything down: dates, times, conversations, threats, missed procedures, inconsistencies in testimony, the way evidence had been presented and then quietly minimized. She filled notebooks late into the night, pausing only when exhaustion took over. Then she started asking questions. Why had Darian been allowed near children despite prior complaints that never reached court? Why had his initial detention been so poorly secured? Why had the prosecution not pushed for a harsher charge despite medical findings that clearly showed intent? The answers, when they came at all, were vague: procedural limits, resource constraints, legal technicalities. Mariah learned a hard truth many families before her had learned. Justice, as written, often moved slower than pain. Still, she pushed forward. She contacted advocacy organizations that focused on violence against children. Many listened, some were cautious, a few warned her that reopening the case could bring retaliation. She already knew that risk. It had followed her since the day she spoke publicly. What she did not expect was how quickly her story would travel once it found the right hands. A regional journalist published a long-form investigation questioning the sentence. The article laid out the evidence in plain language, contrasting it with similar cases that had resulted in far longer sentences. It included interviews with legal experts who openly criticized the court's decision. The article went viral. Within days, Ayla's name appeared on banners, posters, and social media profiles. Candlelight vigils spread across multiple cities. Parents held their children tighter. Teachers spoke her name in classrooms. Strangers who had never been to Cora felt connected to a child they had never met. With visibility came pressure. Government officials released brief statements expressing sympathy while standing by the ruling. Prosecutors defended their strategy. Judges declined interviews. Behind closed doors, however, things were shifting. Maria was contacted by a legal advocacy group willing to review the case for appeal. It was not guaranteed. Appeals were rare, success even rarer. But for the first time, there was a path forward. The process was slow and emotionally draining. Maria had to relive everything: medical reports, autopsy findings, witness statements. She listened again as professionals discussed her daughter as evidence. Each session left her hollow, but she refused to stop. What emerged during the review was deeply troubling. Key aggravating factors had not been emphasized during sentencing. Prior behavioral warnings about Darian had been dismissed as unsubstantiated despite multiple community reports. Threats against Maria after the crime had not been formally included in the sentencing phase. It painted a picture not of a single failure, but of many small ones stacked together. As the appeal moved forward, opposition grew louder. Supporters of the convicted man accused Maria of trying to destroy a family. Online harassment intensified. Anonymous messages flooded her phone. Some warned her to drop the case. Others claimed she was dishonoring her daughter by continuing to speak. She blocked numbers. She changed locations. She learned how to live with fear without letting it control her. One night, after a particularly long day of hearings, Maria sat alone and nearly gave up. The exhaustion was overwhelming. The process seemed endless. There was no guarantee the appeal would even be heard, let alone succeed. She wondered if continuing was only reopening wounds that would never fully heal. Then she remembered something small. Ayla used to ask endless questions. Why was the sky blue? Why did people argue? Why couldn't everyone be kind? Maria realized that stopping now would mean teaching her daughter a lesson she could never accept, that silence was easier, that discomfort should be avoided, that systems could not be challenged. She decided she would rather be afraid than quiet. As public pressure mounted, international human rights organizations began referencing the case in broader discussions about child protection laws. Ayla's story was no longer isolated. It became an example of how legal systems often underestimated crimes against the most vulnerable. Lawmakers could no longer ignore it. A parliamentary committee announced it would review sentencing guidelines related to violent crimes against children. Officials insisted the review was not tied to any single case, but no one believed that. Maria was invited to speak. Standing in that room, surrounded by people in suits, she felt the weight of every word. She did not shout, she did not accuse. She spoke calmly, clearly, and without theatrics. She talked about her daughter's laugh, about the trust children place in adults, and about what it meant for a society when the punishment for such destruction felt negotiable. Some lawmakers looked away. Others listened. The appeal hearing date was finally set. On the morning it began, crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Some held photos of Ayla, others held signs demanding accountability. Inside, lawyers argued points of law, precedent, and proportionality. Maria sat quietly. She had learned that strength did not always need to be visible. When the judges adjourned to deliberate, the wait felt endless. Days passed. Speculation filled the air. Supporters prepared themselves for disappointment. Then the decision came. The appellate court ruled that the original sentencing had failed to properly weigh the severity and intent of the crime. They ordered a resentencing hearing, citing procedural oversight and insufficient consideration of aggravating factors. It was not a victory, but it was a crack in the wall. For the first time since Ayla's death, Maria allowed herself to breathe. The resentencing would not erase what had happened. It would not bring her daughter back, but it would force the system to look again, to confront what it had tried to minimize. As the news spread, messages poured in from around the world. Parents thanked her. Survivors told her they felt seen. Activists called her courageous. Maria did not feel like any of those things. She felt tired, she felt sad, and she felt resolute, because the story was not over yet. The most difficult part still lay ahead. The resentencing hearing did not feel like justice. It felt like exposure. Every flaw that had once been hidden behind procedure was now laid bare under fluorescent courtroom lights. Lawyers spoke carefully, choosing words that carried legal weight but avoided emotion. Judges listened, unreadable. Observers filled the benches, many holding photographs of a child whose smile had become a symbol. Mireya sat in the front row. She had imagined this moment so many times that the real thing felt strangely distant. There was no surge of adrenaline, no sense of triumph, only a steady awareness that everything said in that room would ripple far beyond it. The prosecution began by acknowledging what they had previously minimized. They spoke of intent, not chance, of planning, not impulse, of harm that could not be undone by time served. They referenced expert testimony that had been downplayed the first time. They read aloud reports that described not only what had happened, but what had been ignored. The defense argued consistency. They warned against precedent. They cautioned the court about emotion influencing law. Maria listened without interruption. When it was her turn to speak, the room shifted. Victim impact statements were usually brief, a few minutes, carefully monitored. But this time, the judge allowed her to continue. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She spoke about Ayla as a person, not a case, about mornings before school, about questions that came without warning, about the way her daughter trusted adults because she believed adults were meant to protect. Then she addressed the sentence itself. She said that punishment was not about revenge, it was about truth, about acknowledging the full gravity of what had been done, about ensuring that the law reflected the value of a child's life, not the convenience of a system. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Days later, the ruling was delivered. The sentence was increased significantly. The judge cited the appellate court's findings. He acknowledged that the original sentencing failed to account for key aggravating factors. He spoke about the responsibility of the court to send a clear message, not just to punish one man, but to uphold the standard of protection owed to the most vulnerable. There were no cheers, there were no tears, only a quiet understanding that something had shifted. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, microphones were raised. Reporters asked if Maria felt satisfied. She paused before answering. She said justice was not a feeling, it was a process, and that process was still incomplete. The resentencing marked the end of one fight and the beginning of another. Within weeks, lawmakers formally introduced amendments to sentencing guidelines related to violent crimes against children. What had once been discussed in abstract terms was now grounded in a real case with a real name attached to it. Ayla's name appeared in legal documents, not as a footnote, as a reference. The changes did not happen overnight. There were debates, objections, compromises, but momentum had been created and it did not fade easily. Mireya was invited to advisory panels. She testified again, this time not as a grieving mother, but as someone who understood how systems failed and how they could be improved. She learned the language of policy the same way she had learned the language of law, slowly, reluctantly, out of necessity. Privately, the cost was heavy. Grief does not disappear when justice advances. It adapts. It waits. It resurfaces in unexpected moments, at grocery stores, at playgrounds, at birthdays that come and go without candles. Some nights, Maria wondered if she had traded one kind of pain for another, if carrying Ayla's name into public spaces meant she would never have a private place to rest. But then letters arrived, from parents who said they spoke to their children differently now, from teachers who said they recognized warning signs they once overlooked, from survivors who said seeing the system challenged made them feel less alone. Those letters mattered. They did not heal the wound, but they gave it meaning. Years later, when the case was referenced in academic journals and legal conferences, it was no longer framed as a tragedy alone. It was cited as an example of how advocacy, persistence, and public accountability could alter outcomes once thought final. Maria never became comfortable with that role. She did not see herself as brave. She saw herself as unwilling to accept silence. When asked if she believed the system had learned its lesson, she was honest. Systems do not learn, she said. People do, and people forget unless they are reminded. Ayla's room was eventually changed, not erased, just transformed. The drawings were stored carefully. The shoes were donated. The space became something new, shaped by memory rather than frozen by it. On the anniversary of the resentencing, Maria visited the courthouse alone, not to protest, not to speak, just to stand outside the building that had once felt impenetrable. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, how many times she had been told to move on, how often she had been warned that pushing further would only bring more pain. She knew now that pain was unavoidable. What mattered was direction. Ayla's story did not end with a sentence. It continued in policy rooms, in classrooms, in conversations between parents and children who learned to speak up sooner. It lived in the discomfort of institutions forced to examine their own blind spots. Justice did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as accountability, as visibility, as refusal. And in that refusal, Mireya found something she had not expected. Not peace, but purpose. A quiet, enduring promise that her daughter's name would never be reduced to a statistic or a closed file. It would remain a reminder that systems can be challenged, that silence can be broken, and that even when justice comes late, it still matters that it comes at all.